Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. Over the last month, thousands of Americans have protested police brutality in the wake of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And although the protests have not directly addressed immigration, concerns about immigration law enforcement and racism in the immigration system have emerged as a flashpoint in the immigration debate. This week, we'll examine these issues in three ways: the call to abolish ICE, the relationship between immigration prosecutions and non-citizen populations in federal custody, and the role of race in the U.S. immigration system's evolution. All that's just ahead. Stick around. Here with me today, as always, are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hey, Cris.
Hey, Jordan.
Thanks to you both for being here. All right, as activists have taken to the streets in recent weeks, some are rallying behind a call to defund the police. And that sparked a debate over how to minimize or eliminate police brutality while protecting communities from crime. Now, this has parallels to the debate over abolishing ICE, a move that immigration advocates say would better protect the rights of immigrants. However, the administration and immigration hardliners say these measures would undermine the country's capacity to enforce its borders and protect communities throughout the country. So, Theresa, what's the debate over calls to abolish ICE today, and how does that parallel the demands we've heard recently to defund the police?
Sure. So immigration rights activists and have called on this on the abolishment of ICE for several years now. I think it's a slogan that started in rallies and activism and online, but has taken on a life of its own. It is about a policy that suggests that, at least since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, or maybe especially since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and to another extent, Customs and Border Protection, have become much more militarized, much more militant, and less accountable in the way they treat immigrants in the enforcement of the immigration system. And they are calling for abolishment of those agencies as they exist today. For the most part, the organizations that have called for this have not necessarily said that they want to see no immigration enforcement, but they are talking about how to look at different ways of enforcing immigration law that can treat immigrants in the process with more respect. A focal point of the Abolish ICE movement is immigration detention. And the detention centers that are run by ICE or under contract with ICE by local law enforcement communities and jails, or private companies that have been a focal point of concerns about terrible conditions, extensive, lengthy detention for people who have committed no crimes, and abuses by officials in those facilities, as well as, and especially right now with the COVID, concerns about medical treatment and care in those facilities. So other policies like the way ICE enforces immigration in the country and communities, ICE raids, policies that have separated families, all of these are reasons why many advocates have called for the abolishment of ICE. And I think the parallels with defunding the police are similar. People are raising the concern about how these agencies have used or abused their power and authority, the accountability that these organizations have, and the impact of those enforcement practices on various communities that they interact with.
Cris, what policies have Abolish ICE proponents proposed, and how do those measures line up with the ones sought under the Defund the Police banner?
And the thing about abolishing ICE is that there's no central core platform of what this actually entails. It's more of a spectrum of the extent to which you believe that the agency should exist and whether the agency should be reformed. At its farthest fringe in saying what abolish ICE means, it literally is breaking up the agency, putting various components in other agencies, and basically taking the immigration enforcement components and basically eliminating them. That's sort of the absolutist demand that you see among immigration advocates. But in terms of something that's a little bit more moderate and sensible, a lot of it is increasing oversight over ICE and CBP, sort of working to divert funds from immigration enforcement towards alternatives to detention, for instance. As Theresa was saying, detention's a major flashpoint over immigration enforcement. So diverting some of those funds to basically have individuals not be in detention and be in programs as they await their removal hearings before an immigration judge. Some of it is, ensuring that CBP and ICE are not able to claw back additional funding from other agencies, which is something that's emerged a little bit more in the Trump administration, where this is kind of a practice that we're seeing. So really, it stretches across a spectrum of policy options, and you're sort of seeing that a little bit with this call to defund the police. There is the request that police agencies be completely disbanded. This is sort of a debate that we're seeing happening right now in Minneapolis, where the mayor doesn't want to disband the police, but the city council is considering it. Camden, New Jersey is sort of taking these steps, so that there is examples of localities doing this. But there's also the idea that potentially you need to divert funding towards community programs to improve community relations. Dealing with the militarization of the police. So the Department of Defense has programs to send over equipment, military-grade equipment to local police, agencies at the state and local level that they can use. That's been a target of these efforts. So again, there is no one central policy that falls under these slogans. The slogans can capture a lot of options, but the real key point to take away from this is that there's no one option. There doesn't appear to be a consensus, and I think that that's something that's going to have to be figured out moving forward, especially in the wake of these protests.
Cris, I'll start with you on this one, but I want to get both of your takes on this. What has been the public reaction to the push to abolish ICE? We're not hearing as much about it these days in the media. And what, if anything, does that tell us about how the public and lawmakers might react to these new calls to defund the police?
So if you looked at the polling, especially around 2018, 2019, when this was really sort of starting to hit mainstream media, looking at some polls, Morning Consult and Politico released a poll finding that I think over 50% of respondents really weren't in support of abolishing ICE. I believe it was 54%. And you saw a similar percentage with a poll that was released by the Associated Press around the same time. So in terms of just really where the public is, there doesn't seem to be a lot of support for taking, these measures. Again, we're not sure what the public actually thinks about what abolishing ICE actually is and if they consider different options for that. But there doesn't seem to be a public appetite for really taking this extraordinary step. And the public polling that we're seeing, at least in wake of these protests, seems to indicate that the police agencies need to be reformed. There's a recognition of that, but I don't think that we're seeing major support for completely defunding the police and disbanding that. I think we need some more polling on that, but it doesn't seem to be that that's a consensus where Americans are on that issue. So that's at least what you can see from the polling right now.
The other thing I would say is that, as Cris said, there doesn't seem to be a majority public support for the slogans. If you dive down and start asking about the policies that might underlie the slogans, you do tend to see increased support. And I think that presents the question of, when does a rallying cry or a protest slogan really hurt the cause of the underlying policies you're trying to put forward? And, there's an old saying in Washington, D.C. that if you have to explain your slogan, you've lost, because most people don't go beyond that. And so I do think that, there's policy and there's politics. And what we're seeing right now is the Trump administration is doing with the defund the police campaign the same thing it did with abolish ICE, realizing that a lot of the public doesn't support that idea, at least in the abstract. is diving in and accusing Republicans and opponents of wanting to get rid of all enforcement or get rid of all police agencies, and forcing the advocates then to have to explain themselves and explain their proposals. And so, there's a sort of the messaging battle, there's the policy battle, but it obscures a conversation that should be had on both issues about the way we enforce our immigration laws and the agencies in which that do that, and the way we ensure public safety and the agencies responsible for that. And so some of it has to get beyond just the sloganeering and the yes or no to the slogan, and get down to the what are we trying to fix, and how do we do that. And that's, I think, the pivoting point where you can actually get some things done.
Okay, when we come back, a conversation about the increasing criminalization of immigration and immigrants. So another important part of this conversation about race and the criminal justice system is the prosecution of low-level crimes, an approach that has expanded the population of Black men in federal custody. In the immigration enforcement system, the prosecution of illegal border crossings has likewise contributed to the expansion of the non-citizen population in federal prison. Let's explore how the relationship between these policies and populations in federal custody challenges notions about the inherent criminality of these groups. Cris, what are the contours of the debate over immigrant criminality in the United States today, and where does that debate fit within the larger debate over criminality in communities of color?
Yeah, so broadly, the common thread across these two areas is the notion that because these populations, there are more of them in federal custody or state and local custody, that these individuals are inherently criminal. That these populations are inherently criminal, that they're prone to committing crimes at higher rates, and that they, present a threat to public safety because there's just simply more of them in federal custody or local custody. In the case of immigration, the way that this is sort of articulated itself is that there is a sizable population of non-citizens in federal prison. And what you've seen with hardliners is they like to point to this data and say, well, look at this. Because there are more immigrants in federal custody, therefore a lot of them are, immigrants are criminals and they're committing crimes in ways that Americans aren't. And so that's sort of where it is you see this issue from the immigration perspective. And obviously, to be, pretty blunt, that was sort of the idea with the way that the tough on crime debate that you saw in the 80s and 90s portrayed Black men, inherently seeing them as more prone to basically engaging in criminal acts because there's just simply more Black men that were going to jail. And as a result, the inference here is that there are more of them in jail because they're committing more crimes. So that's, I think, sort of the way that you're looking at this issue, which is that there are just more of them in federal prison or local prison or jails, and as a result, that means they're just simply criminals and they're inherently prone to criminal activities.
Cris, how has the prosecution of non-citizens contributed to the size of the incarcerated non-citizen population, and how does that parallel practices in the broader criminal justice system?
Yeah, this is where the key is actually very, very important to make with this. I looked at sort of the patterns of prosecutions of non-citizens for federal crimes. And what you find is that the majority of the crimes that non-citizens are being prosecuted for are illegal entry and illegal re-entry into the country. So legal entry, somebody entered between ports of entry, they didn't have any type of documentation. And at that point, CBP decides to refer the individual to the U.S. Attorney's Office under the Department of Justice for prosecuting them under this part of the law. I believe it's INA section
1325.
Yeah, 1325. Let's start this back. So what you see is that CBP refers these individuals to the U.S. Attorney's Office under the Department of Justice for violating part of the INA, which is 1325 for illegal entry and 1326 for illegal re-entry for prosecution. Now, the individuals will be removed from the United States, through the removal process. But what they'll do is they'll be prosecuted, and they may do some time in federal prison because of this. Now, what I found is that these prosecution numbers basically directly contributed to the size of the non-citizen population in federal prison. Basically, the prosecutions for committing these minor crimes actually almost had a one-to-one correlation with the number of guilty pleas. So basically, if you prosecuted somebody for this, it's really likely that you can get a guilty plea from the defendant, and then the individual then gets sent to prison. And the period of time for these sentences sometimes isn't very long, but they are counted as part of the federal prison population. And so the takeaway here is that a government policy of prosecuting individuals for illegal entry and re-entry really was, I don't want to say solely responsible for the growth of the non-citizen population, but was the main driving force. And so the parallel with what you see in the criminal justice system, especially in the 80s and 90s, was the idea that we're going to target low-level offenses like possession of marijuana, and we're going to use that to send these individuals to prison, and just try to sort of deter, criminal activity using that method. And so what you see is that you saw the expansion of the population of Black men in particular in federal prison or in state and local prison because of a conscious decision to prosecute specific crimes. So that's, I think, like I said, the common thread is that, the populations in federal custody or in state and local custody really revolve around conscious decisions to prosecute crimes, frequently low-level ones, that then expand the growth of the population. And so as a result, really, it is not necessarily inherent criminality, the reasons why they're why these two groups are in custody, but it's really largely around conscious decisions to prosecute them for that.
Theresa, what types of reforms have immigration advocates called for here, and what does the current political environment look like for making those happen?
Sure. So, part of this is we heard this during the Democratic presidential debates, actually, the idea of taking out these provisions of law that allow these immigration crimes to be prosecuted criminally. That if that those were instituted in 1996, and part of the Immigration Reform Act in 1996 that increased the penalties for a lot of immigration activities across the board, which was of the same time, as Cris mentioned, with a lot of the tough on crime legislation that we saw in the mid 1990s. And so by taking away that criminal prosecution, people would still be deported. They would still suffer immigration consequences, but they would not gain a criminal record. We would not be spending so many of our federal criminal justice system resources in terms of attorneys and prosecutions and jails on what are essentially just immigration crimes. And again, I would say that part of this revolves around the case that many immigrant restrictionists and certainly President Trump has been making, that if somebody is willing to come into the country illegally, then they're more likely to commit other crimes, and there is absolutely no evidence for that. And to use the presence of people in federal prisons who have committed immigration crimes as evidence of that, when there's no evidence they committed other crimes, is erroneous logic, I would say. And I think when we think about the response to that has come mostly from Democrats, although there has been some conservative openness to some of these changes. We did see bipartisanship in the First Step Act, the Criminal Justice Reform Act that was signed by the president, which noted some of these disparities. And I think a similar approach in immigration enforcement of finding ways that people who have fallen afoul of immigration requirements could give restitution and find a way back into the legal side of the system without having to go through, first of all, any criminal prosecution, but maybe even immigration enforcement that's not necessary. Those are ideas that are probably worth exploring and probably could get some bipartisan support, not the least of which for the reason that it would cost the government a whole lot less money if people were paying fines to get back on the right side of the law than having us to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on detention and law enforcement officers. So I do think that there are ways in which these concepts could align and could generate bipartisan conversation. And I think it's, from our perspective, noting how some of these same, frankly, somewhat racially based arguments have been raised within the immigration system is the relevance we see to the broader protest movements that we're seeing today.
All right, after the break, exploring the roots of today's legal immigration system. Finally today, let's look at the history of the legal immigration system and the way views about race impacted its development. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which overturned a 1924 quota system that severely restricted immigration to the United States. And this 1965 legislation was part of the Great Society, Johnson's mid-1960s effort to promote civil rights and eliminate racism across different institutions in American life. The INA eliminated quotas built on racist and xenophobic attitudes toward immigrants from other parts of the world. But despite the elimination of those quotas, questions remain over whether new reforms are needed to continue promoting racial equity through immigration. Theresa, how does the INA fit within Johnson's larger civil rights push?
So reforms to the Immigration and Nationality Act had been on the table for about a decade before Johnson was engaged in it. And as you mentioned, the 1924 Quota Act set quotas for immigrants from countries in the world, actually from regions of the world, based on the census of the population of people of that nationality from 1880. So it really, the 1924 Quotas Act severely restricted, for example, immigration from Asia and Africa. It promoted immigration from Northern and Western Europe. And it was explicitly, if you go back and look at the congressional record of the day, it was explicitly about maintaining the demographic makeup and racial makeup of the United States at that time. There had been calls to reform that system for a long time. And in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act was passed Congress, which reformed the system but didn't change really the country quotas. And Harry Truman actually vetoed that act. It was passed over his veto. But the quotas remained, and it was a symbol that the United States was basically favoring immigration from certain countries over others. Johnson saw this as a problem, particularly in light of the civil rights movement and the work that he was trying to do, that it heavily discriminated against particularly immigrants of color from parts of the world. But also it was restrictive in that he had foreign policy goals in the middle of the Cold War that the Immigration Act prevented him from moving forward on. So, for example, we were embroiled in Vietnam, and we wanted to be able to promote immigration from Vietnam to counter communist influence from the region. And yet the quotas from the previous law did not allow that to happen. So when the 65 Act was passed, it provided that no country in the world would have more or less than 7% of the total number of immigrants that were allowed in each year. So it was equal in that respect. And it also framed the majority of the immigration system around family immigration. And we still have that today. That part was a little more controversial. The change in the quotas was seen as a way that might change the demography of the country. And the provision that majority of the visas would be based on family reunification was at the time advocated by members of Congress who felt that by prioritizing family-based immigration, family members of those already in the United States would sponsor their relatives, and that the new quota system would not have a significant impact on the racial makeup of the United States. So there's a mixed history here. In fact, the outcome of the 1965 Act was a significant change in the nationalities that arrived to the United States. In part, it created new quotas for the Western Hemisphere. So we saw a lot more Latin American migration to the United States. It opened Asian migration for the first time, and the following century and a half saw a significant increase in Asian migration from China, from South Asia, from India. And at the same time, you saw basically a decline in the number of immigrants from Europe, all of Europe, frankly, but primarily Northern and Western Europe, who wanted to come to the United States. So over time, the makeup of immigrants to the United States changed significantly as a result of the 1965 Act. And in spite of the thought that the family unification visas would not change things significantly, family unification visas were a large reason why, for the longest time, the majority of new immigrants were coming from Latin America, as well as Asia, and Africa, for that matter. So, although it was seen and touted as a part of the civil rights legislation, I think its legislative history is a little bit mixed. But the outcome certainly was a very major difference in the racial makeup of immigrants coming to the United States.
Cris, have these reforms over time produced more equitable outcomes for immigrants, and what kind of additional reforms might be needed today?
On this podcast, we've talked a lot about what fair looks like in the immigration system. And when we think about equitable outcomes, there's a lot of ways of looking at this. As Theresa noted, obviously, the elimination of the quota system shifted the demographics towards immigrants from other parts of the world and contributed to a much more diverse group of individuals coming to the United States and sort of changing the demographic makeup of the country. So it certainly made the country a lot more diverse at a demographic level. And certainly that's a reversal from the quota system. But I think the other thing to think about with this, and this is less so thinking about this from a racial justice or racial equity lens, is more how long do people have to wait to be able to get a green card, for instance? And if you're looking at it from a purely immigration perspective from that, the system hasn't been terribly equitable because the fact is that because of the per country caps and the limited number of green cards that are available, both in the employment-based system and the family sponsorship system for green cards, that that you have certain individuals from countries such as India and China in the employment-based categories, or Latin American countries in the family-based categories that are waiting probably in some instances, several decades until they could probably get their green card. And so in that sense, the system may have overturned, an expressly xenophobic and racist law and certainly ameliorated some of the problems with that. But at the same time, the cap system that it established has, produced another negative effect in terms of just people waiting a lot longer. And certainly, there have been efforts to try to reform this. I'm sure Theresa can talk about this a little bit more, but I think it's equitable can mean many things in immigration, and so it is possible for something to have reversed basically expressly xenophobic and racist policies, while producing some new issues on its own of terms of what is fair in the immigration system, what outcomes are fair, and whether or not it's fair to have certain nationalities having to wait a much longer period of time. Certainly much better than the quota system in terms of just simply, managing the adjudications, but certainly has its own problems.
Yeah, I would say that there's a couple of things. As Cris mentioned, the 7% for every country in the world sounds fair, but what it means is that you have the same number of visas allocated for Bhutan as you have for Mexico or India. But clearly the demand for immigration from Bhutan is a lot lower than the demand for immigration from Mexico or India. And that results in, as Cris mentioned, disparities in the wait times. And that's been a political and legislative issue for Congress in the last several years, as many Indian and Chinese immigrants have demanded changes to that system because they're looking essentially at a lifetime of waiting for a green card. And they find that to be unfair. And changes to the system, however, would have impacts on other people who have not had to wait that long. And so you have challenges there. The other thing I think is worth noting is that there have been some attempts since the 1965 Act was passed, most notably in 1990, to try to address some disparities in who has arrived to the United States. So, as I said, the majority of our system is based on family unification. So countries and areas of the world that have larger diasporas in the United States have more ability to sponsor more people to come to the United States. That has disadvantaged some other countries that have not had significant diasporas, significantly Africa, some places in the Caribbean and Eastern Europe and other parts of Asia. And so in the 1990 Act, there was a provision that created what we call the diversity visa, the so-called visa lottery, that was designed specifically to allow a means of immigration to countries that have not had significant numbers of immigrants in the last 10 years, either because they didn't already have diasporas in the United States to sponsor them for family visas, or had difficulty accessing the employment-based system because, again, they did not have connections in the United States. That diversity visa has been the major pathway for new immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, especially, and frankly, Black immigrants from around the world. And so that has made the conversation about the diversity visa heavily influenced by racial questions and racial equity. If we were to eliminate the diversity visa, would that disproportionately affect African and Caribbean and frankly, Black immigrants from those regions of the world? There may be ways to adjust for that if the system were to be changed. But that is a significant issue that has been raised and continues to be raised whenever questions about the continuation of the diversity lottery come forward. So I would say that there are still things to be tackled in our immigration system. Something that sounds facially equitable has had, I would say, inequitable outcomes. And we have to recognize that no legislative change is going to be perfect. Part of the struggle is that it takes so long for us to pass any immigration laws. The average time between major immigration reforms in this country is 30 years. That's ridiculous. If we see problems with the system as it is, we should be able to adjust it more frequently. But the political ossification, if you will, around the immigration issue has made that very difficult. Hopefully, we're at a moment where the country is looking at big change, and that could include big changes to our immigration system to address some of these issues that have persisted over decades.
All right, that's a really good place to leave it for today. Theresa, Cris, thanks as always for joining me. And thanks to you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Cris Ramón and myself. Our producers are Cris Ramón and Yafat Tawahara, and our editor is Yafat Tawahara. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Ashley Swearingen. I'm Jordan LaPier. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.